And now it's my pleasure to introduce Tyler Gilbert himself. Tyler is an instructional coach for a large Central Valley of California district, an education consultant, and a San Diego State University doctoral student. He is dedicated to helping all learners feel seen, heard, valued, and most importantly, noticed through research-backed practices and intentional instructional design. He is also a former elementary educator. And now, without further ado, I will hand it off to Tyler to get us started. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am very, very excited about our learning today. One request that I have is, can we please keep the chat lively? That's really going to be the driving force of the work we do today and a very integral part of the learning today. So with that being said, I want to start off with a specific question, and that is, what makes an excellent teacher? In other words, what distinguishes an expert teacher from a novice one? So take a moment to drop your thoughts in the chat. What do you think in regards to this? Now, as you're thinking, I'll share the reason that I asked this question. Really, it's two reasons, but one is I've always felt that if we can figure out what great teachers are doing and learn from them, then we can all get better in our practices. And that's really the approach I've taken throughout kind of my career. I've always sought out like people who are really, really good at certain things, and I just kind of like mimic those things, and somehow it's led to great results. And the second reason why I asked this question or these questions is that this is really the original question that drove the research and writing behind Does My Teacher Notice Me? And so I'm seeing a lot of great things in the chat. So, man, it's moving fast. So it has the ability to adapt, meet the needs of all students in the classroom, relationship, trust-driven, build relationships, flexibility and reflection, positive mindset, a lot of great things. So the short answer is that expert teachers can be distinguished by the impact they have on students. It's like, well, isn't that obvious, right? But this begs the question, like, how do they make such an impact? Well, we might say that teacher expertise requires experience. However, this isn't quite the truth. Of course, noviceness can be defined by a lack of experience, but expertise is not. And so, unfortunately, I've met many teachers that have been teaching for quite some time, whether it's a decade, 2 decades, sometimes upwards of 3 decades, that are not making that much of a positive or substantial impact. And on the flip side, I have met many teachers that have been teaching for a short period of time, whether it's 2, 3, 5 years, that are making a substantial impact. So then if years in the field do not necessarily correlate to the level of impact, the question is, well, what is it? And the answer is that expert teachers are distinguished by their ability to notice. And so you might be thinking or asking, like, don't all teachers notice things, right? Like little Johnny is 7 minutes late every day. Little Sally is wearing the same hoodie she did yesterday, or little Mikey exceeded on the state assessment last year, and so he must be a high performer. And of course, all teachers certainly notice when they need more coffee, right? Like we certainly notice when we haven't had our fair dose of caffeination, but this isn't the type of noticing we are referring to. This isn't the type of noticing that the research is alluding to when we talk about teacher expertise. So what we're really talking about is teacher noticing? That responsive teaching, that attending to student thinking, interpreting that thinking, and deciding. Now, these are three sort of distinct but also interrelated phases. These are the inner workings of the expert teacher's mind for high quality instructional decision making that happens in the moment. And expert teachers are really good at all three of these phases. So they're really good at attending to student thinking, getting inside of their students' heads and understanding and student thinking. And so this happens through a sort of intake of data through the senses. It's usually verbal or visual and involves this sort of recalling from both short and long-term memory, verbal and nonverbal. So what is happening in the moment, but also thinking about what we know from the student in the past, whether it's previous day, days, weeks, or months. And then interpreting it objectively, trying to mitigate or void the bias. And so making sense of that data, considering the learning objective, the learning goal, learning intention, whatever you want to call it, and current developmental levels and student understanding. And then organizing this data into meaningful relationships. And so that means like really making sense of it on an individual student level, but also on a classroom level, because it can be daunting to try to take in all this data and make sense of it. And so we have to figure out a way to interpret it objectively, but also in a sustainable way. And so from this sort of phase, then we can shift to creating a decision or making a decision that is an appropriate response to elevate the learning experience. And so this can involve applying, elaborating, evaluating, and determining appropriate feedback, or maybe it's scaffolds or intervention or advancement, acceleration, whatever the case may be, to have that high impact. Now, teacher noticing, it's not one of those things that you either have it or you don't. I recall when I first started on this endeavor to write this book, I had a few colleagues just kind of say that, like, well, you either have it or you don't. And that's just simply not true. Time and time again, we see teachers go from novice to establishing their skills and to eventually getting to an expert level of teaching. And so the question is, well, okay, if you can develop teacher noticing skills, then how do you make it happen? And so the way to kind of make it happen, I mean, there's several ways to make it happen, but one way that we can really focus on it is by analyzing a continuum, right? Thinking about noticing skills on a continuum from novice noticing to expert noticing. And all of these require deliberate effort. And the purpose of the continuum really is to be able to analyze, reflect, and refine so that we can consistently work our way towards the right columns there, whether it's the focused or expert noticing teacher. Now, I want to pause here because I want you guys to kind of take in the continuum and just put in the chat, what do you notice there? Specifically, what do you notice, no pun intended, the differences between a novice noticer and an expert noticer? Yeah, right off the top. So I see people in the chat, people are saying novice is teacher centered and expert is student centered. That is like the very significant thing. It's put on top for a reason. And then as you kind of work your way down, you can notice the more nuanced things that are happening between novice and expert. Novice is focused on management, expert is structured. When you focus on student, you start to see what you can do to support students. Expert is student driven. Excellent. So today for our time, um, we're not going to get into all of it. That's really what Does My Teacher Notice Me is about, is how do you develop expertise, particularly as it pertains to these three interrelated phases. But for our time today, we're going to focus on the attending phase and what it means to get inside of students' heads. Like, what does this involve, and how do expert teachers do this really well? And so, one of the key points here is that, well, expert noticers are as much distinguished by what they do not notice as by what they do notice. And the point being is that we're humans. We have this thing called cognitive load, and that can be overwhelmed very quickly in a classroom full of students if we're trying to notice everything about everyone, right? And so expert noticers have this way of precisely picking deliberate things to focus on to move the learning forward. And so Mary Piper, I believe clinical psychiatrist and author, she has this quote and it says, to be able to understand people and be present for them and their experience, that's the most important thing in the world. And I really, when I read this quote, I feel like it's just like the underlying sort of posture or lens of teacher noticing. Now, if I were to iterate this quote, I would say to be able to understand students and be present for them in their learning experiences, well, that's the most important thing a teacher can do. And so, what does it mean to attend? Well, attending involves noting evidence of thinking and understanding. And this sort of approach requires teachers to be curious about their students. It requires genuine curiosity for your students and their thoughts and perspectives. Now, Carol Dweck, probably most known for her work on growth mindset and fixed mindset, she has a simple quote that is, every student has something to teach me. And I really feel that this is the lens of an expert noticing teacher. They approach teaching from this sort of perspective that when I walk into a classroom and teach a lesson, I'm really seeking out for students to teach me about what they know and understand. And so when we think about attending to student thinking, we can kind of correlate it to this concept of checking for understanding. For students to teach you, you need to provide deliberate opportunities for them to do so. And so insert checking for understanding. Now, checking for understanding, CFUs, this is not new to education. I'm sure we're all familiar with it. For decades, teachers have sought to gather data on whether students are making sense of what is being taught. In the 1980s, Madeline Hunter, with her Hunter lesson design, kind of said that teachers should check to see if students are understanding, and you should do it frequently. And then, Dylan William has said that we should check for understanding to give students quality and timely feedback. And so I want to pause here and ask again, what are some ways that you check for understanding in your classroom? I see listening, think, pair, share, exit tickets, conferring with students, monitoring conversations, exit tickets, table talk, partner shares, exit tickets. Quick writes, think, pair, share, whiteboards. Students do problems on whiteboards, self-assessment, empathy interviews, accountable talk, QFY, question from yesterday, exit sketch, a lot of great stuff. So with CFUs or checking for understanding, I'm sure we've all experienced questions like this. Do you understand? Does that make sense? Any questions? Are we understanding? How would you rate your understanding? And the thing is if we are asking questions like these, well, we really aren't getting much information to be able to make an impactful instructional decision, right? If students aren't understanding, then, well, we need to know why. And if they are understanding, then we need to know to what extent. Not to mention, if we ask these questions, right, like the thumbs up, thumbs down, how honest or accurate are those thumbs? If a student sees that the person next to them has a thumb up, are they just putting their thumb up as a sort of peer kind of influence? We don't know, but it doesn't really give us much information, or at least valuable information. And so Fisher and Fry have written quite a bit about checking for understanding, some pretty substantial work. And one of the things that they say, some tips to consider for being successful with checking for understanding is four questions here. So the first one is, do I know what misconceptions or naive assumptions my students possess? How do I know what they understand? What evidence will I accept for this understanding? And how will I use their understanding to plan future instruction? And so these are really high quality questions to consider. But bringing it back to noticing, and specifically the attending phase, I want to focus in on two questions here that are really gets to the heart of the attending phase of teacher noticing. And that is, how do I know what they understand and what evidence will I accept for this understanding? Now, how do I know what they understand? That's significantly different than, do you understand? And so I really want to emphasize that point there. We're really focusing on the how, and also what evidence is acceptable for demonstrating that how. And so the shift here, it's not that it's anything new per se. Really, researchers have been alluding to this all along when we talk about checking for understanding, but I think we've kind of lost sight of it. And what I mean by that is, too often we're asking the questions or giving the CFUs that focus on whether students got it or they didn't. But that's not good enough. That's not good enough information to really have that impact that expert teachers do. And so the shift here that I really want us to think about is thinking about it through thinking. In other words, let's focus on checks for thinking, CFTs. And so, well, what is a CFT? Well, a CFT is a CFU, but it really emphasizes the thinking behind the understanding or misunderstanding. And so CFTs have three characteristics. And so the first one is that they must give teachers visible or verbal access to students' understanding or lack thereof. The second thing is they must be able to reference a success criteria so that the student and teacher can monitor progress toward the learning goal or learning intention. And lastly, they must present a pathway to meeting or exceeding the learning intention. And we'll get to some examples in a bit, but CFTs, a way to think about them is gaining a lot of access to student thoughts and understanding, and gaining just a little bit of access to students' understanding uh, and progress. And so a lot of access happens in kind of the macro lens, right? We call it, or I call it macro CFTs. And so these are planned and deliberate means for accessing student thinking. They are a physical product of student thinking that can be referenced at a later time. They directly align with learning intention and success criteria. And also, they give a pathway for instructional decision making. Now, what I mean by that is I can pick up this product and I immediately or very quickly know exactly what the next instructional move must be. Now, on the flip side, we can call them micro CFTs. And these are sort of really focused on behavior and emotion. They are unplanned or in the moment. They require a teacher to do a quick and intentional scan or prompting. They seek verbal or body language cues from students that indicate understanding or misunderstanding. And they focus on students' emotional responses to learning or tasks. And so this could take the form of body language, right? Like smiling, frowning, confusion, frustration, noise making, putting a hoodie on, putting your head on the desk, all those behavioral cues that indicate something relative to understanding. Now, they just give a little glimpse, not much. And so the idea is that we really want to focus on these macro CFTs. Now, as we engage in this work of embedding CFTs or checks for thinking, there are obviously some challenges that might occur. One is students consistently articulating their thinking clearly. And the response to this, or a way to sort of combat this, is twofold. One is creating an environment that is conducive to thinking, meaning that kids are given opportunities to think often and regularly, and they feel safe in doing so. And the second sort of challenge that might occur is tracking group thinking, right? You have a classroom full of 20, 25, 30, maybe even more students. Well, how do you track all that group thinking and maintain that while providing adequate instructional responses? And that's the short answer is that systems are obligatory. So we have to have a sort of tracking system, whether it's a clipboard or even if you involve students in the tracking itself, right? Students are driving their own learning, whatever the case may be. And so these are sort of potential challenges that could occur as you engage in this work. But getting to attending to student thinking and accessing student thinking, really writing and academic discourse are the easiest ways to get inside your students' heads. And so these are going to be your biggest bang for your buck when we talk about CFTs that fit those three characteristics. Now, whether it's writing or academic discourse, it begins with questioning. And so I often say this sort of mantra, and that is great teaching is about asking the right questions instead of giving the right answers. And so, how do we get students to share their thinking and want to do it regularly? Well, it happens in high quality questioning. And so, questioning in itself is kind of an art form. There's a little bit of a science to it too, but Smith and colleagues, authors of Five Practices in Practice, it's a book that came out through Corwin a few years ago. They really broke down different types of questions for revealing student thinking. And they created these two categories, assessing questions and advancing questions. Now, assessing questions do exactly what they say. They assess understanding. Whoops, sorry. They assess understanding. And then advancing questions are a really quick and simple way to accelerate learners with like zero prep time. So if kids are understanding, you can throw out an advancing question to extend the learning. And so take a look at these assessing questions and advancing questions. What stands out to you? Are these questions that are already in your practice? Do you see questions that you find interesting that you might throw into play tomorrow? What do you notice? Need to be more deliberate. Answers will be more in depth, require more thinking and explaining. Deliberate, advancing questions probe for critical thinking and application skills. Will we get a set of these questions? So I'll share that these questions are in the Teacher Noticing book, but at the end of this presentation, I will provide my email. So if you want these slides, I'm happy to share. Reflection rather than current thought. Advancing is reflective. Great. So now getting back to these tangible products, these CFTs, um, these macro CFTs. So in the book, I talk about 10 different ones, technically 11 that I talk about, but there are many strategies for checking for thinking that are really impactful and effective for attending to student thinking. But I'm going to share a few. So the first one is summarizing. I think we're all familiar with it. Summarizing is a skill that students across all grade levels and disciplines need to be able to do. It is quite possibly the most critical skill to support reading and comprehending. Summarizing is a skill that is often classified as like a lower level of depth of knowledge. But to be honest, reading a passage, deciphering the main idea and supporting details, deciding how different ideas are related to each other, and then articulating it in your own words with clarity and brevity, like that kind of requires abstract thinking, to be honest. But as it pertains to CFTs or checking for thinking, summarizing allows you to quickly see where students are misunderstanding and where they need to go next to progress toward the learning goal. Now, I also included mapping on the same slide because mapping is, in some ways, it's kind of similar to summarizing in the sense that it involves prompting students to identify main ideas, notice key details, and make connections. But mapping is like creating a visual version of it, right? Or a graphic representation of the connections of the main ideas. So when students are mapping or they engage in mapping, they visually represent these connections. And this can happen throughout a learning sequence, or it can happen afterward. But when we're talking about noticing and shifting instruction in the moment, mapping throughout a learning sequence, meaning students are adding to it as the lesson progresses, that is like an amazing opportunity to consistently notice or attend to student thinking as they're moving forward. Another CFT you might consider is that a 60-second sketch. A sketch might be the most literal strategy for making thinking visible. This can involve students creating a sketch on a post-it paper or a post-it, a paper, whiteboard, or digital format. And if you're using post-its, a cool approach to this is that you can have all the students put the post-its on a chart paper or whiteboard or table, and then gather around and have the class or group of students analyze, right, and engage in that interpreting phase of noticing together so that the workload is not all on you. So this can involve looking at commonalities or differences or misconceptions or novel approaches, but it's a great way to engage in this checking for thinking. Another strategy here for checking for thinking is to create a model. Now, models are most known for their use in math and science, but they can be used in any discipline to represent understanding. Models can show conceptual understanding of math, like you see in the photo here, or it can even be used to represent a story's theme. They can be drawn or represented with physical objects, Legos, clay. But the key point here is that for models to be effective, they must give the teacher access to the student's perspective of thinking. Now, the last one I want to share here is it's called the four C's. Now, this one is certainly a bigger ask. It's asking more depth and complexity of students, but it really provides a lot of information for a teacher to notice. And so Project Zero is a Harvard Graduate School of Education Research Center, and they developed this thinking routine. So it's a routine for text-based discussions. And so the four C's are connections, challenge, concepts, and changes. And so the first step would be that students must identify the connections between the text and their own life or learning. The second step would be that students must identify ideas or positions or assumptions they want to challenge or argue against within the text. And the third phase is that they identify concepts or ideas from the text that are important and worth holding on to. And then the last step here is that students identify changes in attitude, thinking, or actions that the text is suggesting for the reader or others. And so there's a lot to unpack with this CFT. This isn't one of those quick kind of things. But it's something that is very fruitful in information in regards to acquiring or attending to student thinking. So there are many ways you can check for thinking that fit under those three characteristics that I listed off. I've only shared a few, but the key thing I want to hit home with here is that CFUs that focus on whether students got it or not is something we really need to steer away from, especially if we are to make any meaningful instructional shifts. So when thinking about formative assessment, focus on the why or the how. Focus on why students understand or misunderstand, or how students understand or how they misunderstand. And so with this subtle but really crucial shift, we make for better opportunities to notice our students and to teach with expertise. Now, my final remarks before we get into a little bit of Q&A are this, bringing it back to noticing. You learn to notice by noticing. And it's a truism, but what makes it a truism is that it's true. The only way to learn to see things accurately and objectively and make quick, quality decisions is to force yourself to notice important things regularly, reflect on that noticing, and self modify. Thank you for your time today. If there are any questions in the chat, we can respond to those. I do want to kind of end with this before we get to the winners. One of the things I love most about the work and really this world of education is being able to connect and collaborate with other educators and leaders. I feel like it's the most significant thing. It's truly the most fulfilling thing that I find. And so here's my contact information. I would love to connect and collaborate. So Tyler W. Gilbert at outlook.com. If you are on Instagram, I'm pretty active on there, Tyler W. Gilbert. If you are on X, formerly known as Twitter, I'm T. Gilbert Teach on there.
All right. Thank you so much, Tyler. And thank you to everyone who joined us and participated today. We did have a question that came through. And if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to ask, now is the time. So go ahead and drop those in the chat. So we did have a question from Braden. He said, how do you take a CFT for a grade? If we aren't checking for understanding, how are they preparing for standardized testing that requires understanding and doesn't analyze thinking as much?
Lot to unpack there. My initial thought is that CFTs are CFUs, right? They are checking for understanding. As far as the grading thing, can you repeat the part just about the grading?
Yeah, it said, how do you take CFT for a grade?
CFT for a grade. Well, that just depends on how you implement it, right? Is it something that is like an independent endeavor? I mean, grading itself is a very hot and sensitive topic. But, is the CFT something that you implement that is students engage with individually? Then I don't see why it couldn't be the case that you leverage it for grading. But the purpose is that it really is a tool to drive learning forward. Whether using it for grading or not, that's your choice. But the ultimate purpose is to be able to attend to student thinking and drive learning forward.
All right. And then Natasha asked, wouldn't a CFT be an indicator of a student's success on a CFU?
Could be. Again, there's a CFT is a CFU. I think there might be some confusion there. The point is that the CFUs we want to stay away from are this, they got it or they didn't, right? And so when we embed CFUs, we really want to emphasize that thinking behind it.
And yeah, thank you again to Tyler. Thank you to everyone who participated today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.